Hey everyone, welcome to my channel, Books, Girls, and Purrs. My name's Leslie, and today we are in the spoiler corner. I just finished reading The Wretched of the Earth by Fanon. I will say, before I get started, I don't think I'm gonna do this book any justice. This is the first book that I've ever read during my time on BookTube that I feel maybe a little bit nervous to discuss, not because of the content, but because I don't think I'm going to do this book any justice. I read this once and I dual hybrid read this with the print, took notes, and used the Libby app to borrow the audiobook from my local library. Because the material, at least for me, is very dense, and the author talks about a lot of politicking, and some of it I'm not completely aware of, which is good in terms of getting myself into or just like getting new knowledge, I guess, almost like on a surface level, because there's just so much I'm going to have to deep dive into after I read this book. If I had the time, I would honestly prefer to read this 2 more times before I even did a segment, but here we are. I have an agenda for the entire year, so I'm going to, I'm just going to start. I don't know how else to do this. Hopefully you can't hear my cat. My cat, Ginger, you've met her before. She's the larger cat. She's been very needy, and so you might hear her meowing. I close the door to keep her out. Love her, but she's a lot today. So, with that said, I'm trying to figure out where to start. All right, so I googled some information about the author. He didn't live very long. He died in his 30s, like around 36. I wish there was a documentary done on Fanon. That would be really helpful. So about the author, in 1960 he was appointed ambassador to Ghana by Algeria's FLN-led provisional government. That same year, Fanon was diagnosed with leukemia. In 1961, he received treatment for the disease in the United States, where he later died. I don't know enough about his travels, but I wonder why he decided to get treatment in the States. We are a capitalist system, so there's a lot to say there. Yeah, so he had a very short life. And with that said, when he wrote this book, I believe this is like the last book he wrote, and it was published before, just like before he passed away. But the book is definitely written with a sense of urgency. There's this like, I guess, urgent call to action, and ultimately it is like this communist manifesto. And the author very much believes in change requires a violent uprising. And so when I was reading this book, I couldn't help, my mind was wandering and thinking about Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones and how she says that she chooses violence. I just kept thinking about that, even though it's kind of a silly reference for such a serious book. And so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and read the back of the book. This segment is going to be quote heavy. There's just too much for me to try to paraphrase into my own words, and I would rather get it right, basically. Alright, so in the back it says, first published in 1961 and reissued in this 60th anniversary edition with a powerful new introduction by Cornel West. Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth is a masterful and timeless interrogation of race, colonialism, psychological trauma, and revolutionary struggle, and a continuing influence on a movement from Black Lives Matters to decolonization, a landmark text for revolutionaries and activists. The Wretched of the Earth is an eternal touchstone for civil rights, anti-colonialism, psychiatric studies, and Black consciousness movements around the world. Alongside Cornel West's introduction, the book features critical essay by Jean-Paul Sartre, I hope I'm saying that right, and Homi K. Bhabha. The 60th anniversary edition of Fanon's most famous text stands proudly along such pillars of anti-colonialism and anti-Semitism as Edward Said's Orientalism and the autobiography of Malcolm X. Alright, so when we start this, there's 3 chapters before we even get to Fanon's work. There's an introduction, a foreword, and a preface. And that's just a lot. That's a lot. I appreciated the preface and the foreword. There's an introduction by Cornel West since this is the 60th anniversary, but I just felt like there was just so much that was said before I get to the actual material that Fanon wrote. And also, the preface does help put his work, or actually the foreword. The foreword by Homi K. Bhabha felt like an important chapter because he's putting everything that Fanon wrote in this book into context. Or you could say like reframing it for the reader. That was helpful, but by the time I slogged through it, I felt like it was a lot. I did want to share a quote, or like 2 minor quotes from Cornel West's introduction. So on page 7, he writes, Fanon is deepening, refining, and slightly stretching Marxist analysis by wedding an unrelenting critique of predatory capitalism and its imperial tentacles with an empire-driven analysis of a war-like white supremacy that permeates the very souls of colonial subjects as well as shapes every sphere of colonial society. And then he goes to write on in 11 on the introduction, Fanon always connected the psychic and political and existential and the economic, the spiritual and the social. And that alone actually just breaks down the different segments of Fanon's work and the way that he approaches each subject. All right, everyone, I took like a crazy amount of notes. Hopefully I could read them. I usually just like to talk to the camera. I might be looking down quite a bit. I'll try not to so much. Once again, there's just like so much I want to kind of tackle, but make sure that I'm not all over the place. Fanon breaks up his book into 5 sections and an additional conclusion. The first section is on violence. The second is grandeur and weakness of spontaneity. Third is the trial and tribulations of national consciousness. 4 is on national culture. 5, colonial war and mental disorder. So in the segment called On Violence, Fanon states that colonialism is intentional, it's a planned scheme, and there are 2 borders that are established, barracks and the police. There's economic disparity and inequality. Colonialism views, or I should say the colonists view indigenous people as a redundancy or superfluous, hence genocide. And in order to do so, the colonist must dehumanize the colonized. And when it comes to the economic attributes. There's this circular, I guess you could say, the cycle of white supremacy complex, right? Where wealth is inherited by white society, and then white society are the ones that are rich, and that loop, that structure of inequality in economics continues. What the colonized fear is losing their stronghold on their colonial structure. So in order to maintain that stronghold over the colonized, there are different contributing factors. There's individualism, there's separatism, there's the colonial bourgeoisie. I don't know if I could say that right. I heard it while I was listening to the audio and it was like so hard to say. Then there's like the regionalists. Ultimately, what the colonial structure does and has to continue to perpetuate is to control the historical narrative, thus controlling reality. And ultimately, it's their words that are a form of violence. And also to continue the stronghold, colonists are willing to negotiate, right? Because it wants the colonized to stick in their crafted status quo. And so it's all these different elements that take place that in Fanon's mind, he thinks that violence, a violent rebellion is ultimately the option. And to do so, people have to galvanize and come together. And they have to be willing to unify on the vision instead of, I guess you could say, buying into the trap of what the colonists do, which is to keep us divided, keep us with that crab in a bucket mentality in order to control us. So again, we cannot break away from that until we visualize the enemy that is colonialism and the colonists, be willing to implement a plan in order to galvanize, unite, and overthrow colonialism. The author does briefly touch upon class. I'm like simplifying this a little bit, but he really talks about how it's the peasants, the peasantry that stokes revolution, and it's the other classes that hold on to individualism and their own selfish needs that will actually hold on to and support colonialism. He does go on to bring up, how do I say this, real life, if not at the moment, but or like historical events as examples. One of them that he brought up was the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya. And that was a rare moment in this book where I actually felt like I had something that I've read before for context. And I brought it with me. There's a couple of books I was thinking about that I wanted to bring up as examples. Last year I read A Grain of Wheat by Ngũgĩ Thiong'o. This is a piece of historical fiction, and it does touch upon the Mau Mau Rebellion, but like right after they won, and there's a couple of characters that reflect on what happened, and so there's definitely this psychological element as well to people coping with war, rebellion, reclaiming their land. And so Fanon does use the Mau Mau Rebellion as an example. If you're not familiar with it, I'm sure there's plenty of nonfiction examples, but I really did enjoy reading this as far as understanding historical context. So this is definitely worth picking up because Fanon does bring up the Mau Mau Rebellion quite a few times. And also by the same author, I read Decolonizing the Mind. And I'm actually really glad that I read this beforehand. For lack of better words, this felt almost like a primer to reading Fanon's work. Because what Thiong'o does is, I felt like he laid the foundation for understanding the language and some of the elements that are personal in how a colonial structure creates a stronghold in the land and language. And so that's a big part of his writing, is talking about like the language of the colonizer. And I felt like that really touched upon what Fanon was saying about how language can be used as a form of violence. And I found that this material was apt to that. Additionally, what Fanon talks about when he was mentioning how the colonizer crafts history that then shapes our reality, that really rang true for me. For also another, no, actually it wasn't fiction, it was nonfiction. There's an essay, and in its Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements. This is an incredible book. I absolutely loved it. And one of the essays that stood out to me that I should just like memorize this quote because I love it so much. Oh, let me tell you what it's called. Star Wars and the American Imagination by Mumia Abu Jamal. This is such a short essay in this selection, but it's like 3 pages. It's really an incredible piece. But I'm going to read a quote from this because I think it really speaks to what Fanon is saying about history being written by the colonizer. So Abu Jamal writes, America, the empire, didn't like its role, at least among its young. It wanted to reimagine itself as a ragtag band fighting against great odds, against an evil empire. It imagined itself as it wanted to be, as it had claimed to be in its infancy, against a cruel and despotic king in the late 18th century. It shaped itself into the rebels, not the imperial overlords. It shaped itself as oppressed, fighting for freedom. But America, like every nation, has its ages of psychosis. It has its fits of indecision and periods of self-delusion. And I think that really spoke to how Fanon speaks of the machination of colonialism, maybe even I'll go so far as to say the American ideal, and the history that they weave. So I thought those were also important extensions of what Fanon touches upon that I thought were apt to talk about. And so Fanon goes on to say that we in a colonial structure need to move beyond capitalism versus socialism, colonialism versus anti-colonialism, and then have a new focus of distribution to wealth. But that cannot come until we strike with violent rebellion, and that violence itself is this confidence builder as an oppressed people are meant to be held down, meant to feel guilty, i.e. Being policed, and treated as inferior. And so that's just like a very strong point for him. I should say a very strong stance for him to take. But yeah, so that's how he feels. And so that section is on violence. I'm going to shoot these in different segments because it's a lot to take in. And also as I was taking notes, I would kind of go back and reassess what I read and what I took away from it. So this video is going to be a little bit choppy, but here we are. Hey everyone, and we're back. And my cat is on a rampage. So we'll see how this goes. The next section, should have dropped all my notes. On to the new section. Grandeur and weakness of spontaneity. On violence, that first section was the largest section, and then it kind of shortens up from there. The author disseminates the information via a national party versus the masses, which is basically the people. And so the author goes on to say the masses, they want improvement and they want it quickly, and they're considered the rural part, the peasantry. There's also the proletariat, so like the working class, that are not politically conscious, and that they're part of the problem because they're not politically conscious, they're really just helping how the colonial system hurts by not participating. The masses will question ideology, and then he goes on to say that it's activist groups that are comprised of the unemployed, people that have been previously imprisoned. There goes my cat. Yeah. What do you want? Come here. And that group of activists will create like an underground party, but once become legitimized, they then become a part of the problem, and that leads to a dead end. And so this is just a scenario the author is providing to further support his thesis, which is that a violent rebellion is needed. He also goes on to talk about the National Party and who's comprised of that National Party and what they do. So as where the masses want improvements, national parties will try to hold down the masses, and they don't want to piss off employers. So they're really not for like the little guy. And how there's this political part of the, or how do you say, he labels like there's like a certain colonial population that's the privilege, which he calls the bourgeoisie. I know I'm saying that wrong, I'm sorry. But that they are the ones that support the national parties and uphold colonialism. And ultimately, another part of colonialism having its stronghold is to constantly disrupt. It's not something that colonialism can't just like sit there. They have to actively participate to, I would rather say the word destroy rather than disrupt. So in other words, where the land is still and at peace, colonialism will come in to disrupt and take over. And that the colonist figures, what they'll do is ultimately when they go into the land, they're then also disrupting the people. So they'll just disrespect and belittle indigenous leaders, dehumanize them, become aggressive, and make no effort to assimilate or to learn the ways of the indigenous people and how they navigate their land. The author does go on to use Mau Mau Rebellion again as an example, and ultimately he says that what's needed is like an insurrection, and that it is the lumpen proletariat that are not active that are definitely like a part of the problem. And so ultimately when he says that he's calling for violence, for the author, he thinks that a war equates to politics anyways, and so that's what's needed. For instance, there's a Angolan leader, Robert Holden, that realized that his combat tactics had to change. And that kind of reminded me of how the author was commenting on how colonizations and colonists have to constantly disrupt in order to have their stronghold. So I feel like the author's saying on the flip side, resistance needs to constantly change their tactics to I don't know, make an impact and be efficient. Because something what the colonists will do is change like their behavior. So there'll be like a behavior modification. So maybe the police will pull back and treat others like a human being, and like change their language and how they treat people in order to kind of like temper a rebellion. But really it's not meant to like last long. It's just to for the colonists to keep their stronghold. And so that's basically the end of that section. And then I'll read you like the last paragraph. Sorry, my cat's underneath. I know she is. She's drumming nuts. There she is. And so in the last page, the author writes, violence alone perpetuated by the people, violence organized and guided by the leadership, provides the key for the masses to decipher social reality. Without this struggle, without this praxis, there is nothing but a carnival parade and a lot of hot air. All that is left is a slight readaptation, a few reforms at the top, a flag, and down at the bottom a shapeless, wreathing mass, still mired in the dark ages. So, the author also did mention that when it comes to rebellion, when it comes to insurrection, when it comes to a violent uprising, there still has to be a plan. There must be an understanding of what's to be reached like on the other side. All right, and that's the end of that section, and then I'll be back. All right, everyone, we're on to the trials and tribulations of national consciousness, which is the third section. And the author says that the national consciousness is cruel, it's a fragile shell, and that it is the national bourgeoisie that is responsible for its deprivation. But once this takes place and the colonizers leave, there's like the secondary colonist of intellectuals that will swoop in. They're, according to Fanon, they're lazy, they don't really want to work, they don't know how to invest, and that they're just going to further damage the society. And it's those tools of individualistic advancements that hurt everyone. And on page 127, I wanted to quote that because I felt like it was apt. Fanon writes about leadership. Leader comes from the English verb to lead, meaning to drive. In French, the driver of people no longer exists today. People are no longer a herd and do not need to be driven. If the leader drives me, I want him to know that at the same time, I am driving him. So that really speaks to taking control of your own life and not having someone lead you or take on like a sheep mentality. And on page 133, the author writes, in recognizing their interest and identifying their enemies, the people understand that wealth is not the fault of labor, but the spoils from an organized protection racket. The rich no longer seem respectable men, but flesh-eating beasts, jackals, and ravens, who wallow in the blood of the people. So he has some strong words for them. All right, everyone. Diaries of a Single Working Mother. Continue. I've been kicked out of my office / kitchen office. I'm holding onto the camera. Hopefully I could get through this and you can hear me, and this is too close to my face. But I'm using my arm, so this is the best I could do. Alright, so where did I leave off at? 4? So chapter 4 is on national culture. And so Frantz Fanon states that pre-colonial culture can no longer be reclaimed. And then he talks about the colonized writer and what they write, and he says that they write to prove that assimilation, that they have assimilated. And the second point is that their convictions get shaken and that they try to rally the colonized. And they also write what is the third stage, which is combat literature. And that's part of the galvanization process. I don't know if that's a word, but I'm going to make it one. And something else that the colonized writer tries to push is that culture cannot exist without colonization. And then on page 177, I'm going to have to quote it. Oh shoot, where was I at? Oh yeah. And in terms of what do you call it? Combat literature. There's a couple of them. There's combat literature, there's revolutionary literature, national literature that emerges from that third stage. And then shaky camera, because I'm not very strong. On page 177, Fanon writes, the nation is not only a precondition for culture, it's evolution, it's perpetual renewal and maturation. It is a necessity. First of all, it is the struggle for nationhood that unlocks culture and opens the doors of creation. So it's not like he's saying that that's what colonialism defines as what is required to make a culture, which is just like, come on, do we all need to be in the struggle bus? I was like so irritated when I read that. And so I think that's all of that was chapter 4. Oh no, there's more. Hold on, let's see, what else did I miss? Oh yeah, and that colonization, it is an insatiable thing, right? So it's gonna just keep going, like I said earlier, like chapters ago, that there's this constant need to disrupt. So now they're at the point where the colonizer wants everyone else to know on other nations, other continents, that their people has no culture, that they're dependent, that they can't think for themselves, and that they're all dependent on colonization taking place, which is not true, but it happens. So, oh, and this all amounts to the colonized intellectual making this happen, having this implemented. And that's the colonized believe that that's their concept of nationhood, right? And that's the end of that chapter. And then the next chapter is colonial war and mental disorder. And I'm gonna summarize this up because it's been a long segment. How do I say this? Fanon talks about different psychological cases, and so he'll talk about cases where, how should I say this? You know what? I don't want to get too detailed, so I'll say this. So ultimately what he's getting at is that the trauma of colonialism creates someone performing self-harm or harming others, or passing on generational trauma and how that's exhibited, which could also be through harming others, right? Through abuse. And that trauma also manifests in the body and the mind. So whether it's psychological disorders taking place because of what someone's been through, and also he also talks about these are not just effects of what someone's has conflicted, what do you call it? Afflicted on them? I can't think of the word. Or what they've afflicted on others too, right? And so that creates trauma. And so that could even affect the body physically, the person's sleep, and their developing mental disorders. And so he goes into great detail through various cases to discuss that. And in conclusion, I'm going to read just one last quote. Oh my goodness, this is like, this might as well be a vlog. This is so long. Okay. In conclusion, the author writes, 2 centuries ago, a former European colony took it into its head to catch up with Europe. It has been so successful that the United States of America has become a monster where the flaws, sickness, and inhumanity of Europe have reached frightening proportions. And oh my gosh, because did I have that looking down the whole time? So ultimately what he is saying is that the colonized need to leave Europe, flee. There's nothing for them there. After all the looting and destruction that Western societies have done, all that they leave behind is rubble. So I enjoyed the book. I'm not going to be doing any insurrection or a violent uprising, but I do appreciate and respect what the author is saying. I appreciate how the author is pointing out the political cycles. And there are plenty of other examples I didn't bring up because then this video would just, this segment would be too long. He does heavily lean on Algeria. Am I saying that right? For examples, I didn't bring those up. I only brought up the Mau Mau rebellion lightly just because it was the one thing I could grab onto because I had some like minor knowledge of it. But yeah, so I definitely feel like I enjoyed reading this. I enjoyed his critique of colonialism and capitalism because they are definitely two sides of the same coin. And I want to read all his other work. I would say that I was a little bit nervous when I first picked this up. I thought it was going to be too redundant from what I also read from, what's the author's name? Ngũgĩ Thiong'o. I thought it was just going to hit too much of similar points. And that wasn't the case. Fanon just dug so deep and just captured the different patterns that happen in different continents, different countries, but how the tactics are the same. And so I really appreciated that deep dive, and the psychology of it all was really, really important. And the class structures, how much of the class and economic structures play such a big part in this. So yeah, that's it. Thank you. I basically like paraphrased. I noticed that like when it's nonfiction, I have a hard time like interpreting or adding like my opinions on the material just because I feel like who am I? I mean, Fanon is incredible. He's like such a well educated person, and I am not that. I'm just here reading it and barely trying to understand it. And so yeah, so there's just unfortunately a lot of paraphrasing. If you've read this, let me know what you think. Please correct me. This is an Agent of Chaos, so I'm really kicking off a new year on a bumpy ride. Just trying to put this together. I did find someone else's YouTube channel that I'm not familiar with, but they also talk about Fanon, but like in a way more in-depth, coherent way than I did. And so I'm gonna go ahead and add that to the details. Yeah, that's all I could think of. Like, subscribe, comment below. Let me know if there's any other work that you've read that talks about decolonization that you could recommend to me. I'd really appreciate it. I'm sorry for the shaky camera. It's just the one arm on my couch as I'm trying to do this. Alright everyone, thank you, love you, and I'll see you later.